She thought her life was simple, a waitress, working long shifts, and barely making ends meet. But in a single moment, her world collided with his. A millionaire, with a broken past and everything money could buy, fell for her without hesitation. Yet, what began as a story of unexpected love quickly spiraled into something far more dangerous. Their connection was undeniable, but hidden within their romance was a truth so shocking it could tear them apart forever. As their worlds intertwined, one small detail, so insignificant it seemed meaningless, would unravel everything. A single spoon, a symbol of wealth, betrayal, and devastating secrets. With everything at stake, could love survive a truth neither of them saw coming? Or would the life they both dreamed of slip away in an instant? The answer lies in a moment you'll never forget. The streets of New York City pulsed with an electric energy as night fell, but for Grace Thompson, that energy was pure adrenaline. Her heart raced as she sprinted down a dimly lit alley, clutching a wrinkled envelope stuffed with cash. The sound of her footsteps echoed off the brick walls, matching the frantic rhythm of her heartbeat. "Just a few more blocks," she whispered to herself, her breath coming in ragged gasps. As Grace rounded the corner onto a busier street, she ducked into a shadowy doorway. With trembling hands, she unzipped her backpack and pulled out a neatly folded waitress uniform. In a practiced motion, she slipped the apron over her head and smoothed out the creases. The transformation was startling. Gone was the desperate thief, replaced by a seemingly innocent server ready for her shift. Taking a deep breath, Grace emerged onto the sidewalk, her pace now measured and calm. She pushed open the heavy glass door of Le Petit Chateau, a high-end French restaurant where she worked. The sudden warmth and the rich aroma of garlic and butter enveloped her, a stark contrast to the cold, grimy streets she'd just left behind. "You're cutting it close, Grace," hissed Madeline, the maitre d', as Grace hurried past. "Sorry, Mad." The subway was a nightmare. Grace lied smoothly, flashing an apologetic smile. As she made her way to the kitchen, Grace's eyes darted nervously around the dining room. The patrons, draped in designer clothes and dripping with jewelry, were oblivious to the double life of the young woman who would soon be refilling their water glasses. In a quiet corner of the restaurant, Richard Blackwood sat alone, absently swirling a glass of Bordeaux. At 45, he cut an imposing figure, salt and pepper hair, chiseled features, and a tailored suit that screamed old money. But there was a weariness in his eyes, a barely concealed pain that spoke of recent heartbreak. Richard's gaze wandered, seeking a distraction from his thoughts, when it landed on Grace. Something about her caught his attention, perhaps the way she moved with nervous energy, or the flickers of emotion that crossed her face when she thought no one was looking. She was beautiful, yes, but it was more than that. There was a depth to her, a complexity that intrigued him. As Grace approached his table, their eyes met. For a brief moment, the world seemed to slow down. Richard felt a jolt of electricity, a spark of connection he hadn't experienced in years. Grace, caught off guard by the intensity of his gaze, nearly stumbled. "Good evening, sir," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Can I get you anything else?" Richard opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a commotion erupted from a nearby table. "Waiter! Waitress! Someone!" A portly man with a ruddy face was waving his arms. "I specifically asked for a soup spoon, and this is clearly a dessert spoon. Is it too much to ask for proper service in this establishment?" Grace hurried over, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry, sir. I'll fetch the correct spoon right away." As she turned to head back to the kitchen, Grace's hand brushed against the tablecloth, causing the offending spoon to clatter to the floor. She bent to pick it up, and as her fingers closed around the cool metal, her blood ran cold. There, etched into the handle, was an intricate design she recognized all too well. It was the same pattern she had seen on silverware in one of the houses she and her crew had robbed just last week. Grace's vision swam, and for a terrifying moment, she thought she might faint right there in the middle of the dining room. How had the spoon ended up here? Were they onto her? Was this all about to come crashing down? With trembling hands, She placed the spoon on the table and forced a smile. "I'll be right back with the correct utensil, sir." As Grace retreated to the kitchen, she could feel Richard's eyes following her. The weight of his gaze seemed to bore into her back, as if he could somehow sense the turmoil roiling beneath her calm exterior. In the safety of the kitchen, Grace leaned against a cool stainless steel counter, trying to steady her breathing. She closed her eyes and, unbidden, an image of her mother came to mind, frail and pale in her hospital bed, tubes snaking from her arms, the steady beep of machines the only indication of life. "This is why you're doing this," Grace reminded herself. "For her. It's all for her." But as she picked up a fresh soup spoon and prepared to return to the dining room, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that her carefully constructed world was beginning to unravel. And somehow, she knew that the man in the corner, Richard Blackwood, would play a pivotal role in whatever was to come. With one last deep breath, Grace pushed through the kitchen doors, unaware that she was about to embark on a journey that would challenge everything she thought she knew about love, loyalty, and the price of redemption. As she approached Richard's table once more, their eyes locked, and in that moment, both of them felt the inexorable pull of destiny. Neither could have guessed how a simple spoon would set in motion a chain of events that would change their lives forever. The soft glow of candlelight danced across the polished surfaces of Le Petit Chateau, casting a warm ambience over the dining room. For the third time that week, Richard Blackwood found himself seated at his usual corner table, his eyes scanning the room with barely concealed anticipation. He wasn't here for the expertly prepared cuisine or the extensive wine list. No, Richard was here for her. As if summoned by his thoughts, Grace appeared, weaving between tables with practiced ease. Richard watched her, captivated by the graceful way she moved, the gentle smile she offered to each patron. But it was the flashes of something deeper, a hint of sadness in her eyes, a moment of distraction, that truly drew him in. "Good evening, Mr. Blackwood," Grace said as she approached his table, her voice warm but guarded. "The usual tonight?" Richard nodded, his fingers absently tracing the stem of his water glass. "Please, Grace, and if you have a moment, I'd love to chat." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Grace's face, but she quickly masked it with a polite smile. "Of course, sir. I'll be back with your order shortly." As Grace retreated to the kitchen, her mind raced. Richard's increasing interest in her was both thrilling and terrifying. Part of her longed to open up, to experience a connection with someone who seemed genuinely interested in her as a person. But the larger part, the part consumed by guilt and fear, knew that getting close to anyone, especially someone like Richard, was dangerous. In the sanctuary of the kitchen, Grace leaned against a cool stainless steel counter, closing her eyes for a brief moment. The weight of her double life pressed down on her, threatening to crush her beneath its burden. She thought of her mother, lying in a hospital bed across town, kept alive by machines that beeped and whirred day and night. The image steeled her resolve. This was why she did what she did. This was why she couldn't afford to let anyone in. "Order up for table 12. The sharp voice of the head chef snapped Grace back to reality. She gathered Richard's meal and made her way back to the dining room, schooling her features into a mask of calm professionalism. As she set the plate before Richard, he looked up at her with those piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through her carefully constructed facade. "Grace," he said softly, "I hope I'm not being too forward, but I was wondering if you might join me for dinner sometime? Not here, of course. Perhaps somewhere where you're not on the clock." The invitation hung in the air between them, laden with possibility and danger. Grace's heart raced, a war raging within her. She opened her mouth to decline, to make up some excuse, but what came out surprised even her. That would be nice, Mr. Blackwood." Richard's face lit up with a genuine smile, the kind that made the corners of his eyes crinkle and sent a flutter through Grace's chest. "Wonderful, and please, call me Richard." As Grace nodded and turned to attend to her other tables, her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. With trembling hands, she pulled it out just enough to see the screen. It was a message from one of her partners in crime. "Meeting tonight, 2 a.m., usual spot." Don't be late. We need to talk about the split. The words sent a chill down Grace's spine. The split referred to their cut from the recent string of burglaries, including the one that had yielded the very spoon that had nearly given her away just days ago. The memory of that moment, of the fear and panic that had gripped her, came rushing back. For the rest of her shift, Grace moved through the restaurant like a ghost, her body on autopilot while her mind raced. She was vaguely aware of Richard's eyes following her, his gaze a mixture of curiosity and concern. As closing time approached, she found herself both dreading and longing for the end of her shift. Just before midnight, as she was hanging up her apron, Richard approached her one last time. "Grace," he said, his voice low and gentle. "I hope you don't think I'm overstepping, but is everything all right? You seemed distracted tonight." For a moment, Grace felt the overwhelming urge to confess everything: the robberies, her mother's illness, the crushing weight of her secrets. But she swallowed hard and forced a smile. "I'm fine, Richard. Just a little tired. Thank you for asking, though." He nodded, clearly unconvinced but unwilling to push further. "Well, get some rest, and I'm looking forward to our dinner. How does Friday sound?" "Friday sounds perfect," Grace replied, the lie tasting bitter on her tongue. As she watched Richard leave the restaurant, Grace felt a pang of longing so intense it nearly brought her to her tears. Here was a man who seemed to genuinely care, who looked at her and saw more than just a waitress or a pretty face. And yet, she knew that if he ever discovered the truth about her, that look of warmth and interest would turn to disgust and betrayal. With a heavy heart, Grace left the restaurant and melted into the night, her steps taking her not towards home and rest, but towards the shadowy meeting that awaited her. As she walked, the weight of her choices pressed down upon her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking a tightrope with no safety net below. Little did she know, the decisions she would make in the coming days would not only determine her own fate but would irrevocably alter the lives of those around her, including the man who was quickly becoming more than just another customer. The New York City night swallowed her up, the promise of Friday's dinner with Richard a beacon of hope in the darkness that surrounded her. But as the city's shadows deepened, so too did the conflict in Grace's heart, setting the stage for a confrontation that would test the very limits of love, loyalty, and redemption. The soft glow of candlelight flickered across the white tablecloth, casting dancing shadows over the fine china and crystal glasses. Grace sat across from Richard in one of New York's most exclusive restaurants, feeling as out of place as a sparrow among peacocks. Her simple black dress, borrowed from a coworker, seemed to shrink under the appraising glances of the other diners. Richard, however, only had eyes for Grace. His gaze was warm, tinged with curiosity and something deeper that made Grace's heart race with both excitement and fear. "I'm glad you agreed to join me, Grace," Richard said, his voice low and intimate. "I've been looking forward to getting to know you better." Grace managed to smile, willing her hands to stop trembling as she reached for her water glass. "Thank you for inviting me, Richard. This place it's beautiful." As they perused the menu, Grace's mind whirled. Every fiber of her being screamed that this was a mistake. She didn't belong here, in this world of wealth and privilege. More importantly, she couldn't afford to let anyone get close, to risk exposing the dark secrets that lurked beneath her carefully crafted facade. The waiter approached, and Richard ordered for both of them with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to the finer things in life. As he spoke, Grace's phone buzzed in her clutch. She ignored it, but the nagging worry of what that message might contain gnawed at her. "So, Grace," Richard began as the waiter departed, "tell me about yourself. What brought you to New York? What are your dreams, your passions?" The questions, innocent as they were, felt like a minefield. Grace took a sip of water, buying herself a moment to gather her thoughts. "Well, I came to New York for opportunity, I suppose, like so many others. As for dreams..." She paused, a lump forming in her throat as she thought of her mother, of the mounting medical bills that drove her to her nightly activities. "I just want to make a better life for myself and my family." Richard nodded, his eyes soft with understanding. Family is important. Are they here in the city with you? Grace's grip tightened on her water glass. My mother is. She's not well. Something in her tone must have betrayed the depth of her pain. For Richard reached across the table, his hand covering hers. The gesture, so simple and yet so intimate, sent a jolt through Grace. I'm sorry to hear that, he said softly. Is there anything I can do to help? For a moment, Grace was tempted. How easy it would be to accept his help, to unburden herself of the crushing weight she carried. But the thought of her partners, of the promises she'd made and the lines she'd already crossed, held her back. That's very kind of you, she managed, gently withdrawing her hand. But we're managing. The conversation drifted to lighter topics as their meal arrived. Richard spoke of his work in finance, of the challenges and rewards of building his empire. Grace listened, offering small insights into her life at the restaurant, carefully skirting around anything too personal. As the evening wore on, Grace found herself relaxing despite her better judgment. Richard was charming, intelligent, and genuinely interested in what she had to say. For a few precious hours, she could almost forget the double life she led, could almost imagine herself belonging in this world. But reality had a way of intruding, even in the most magical of moments. You know, Richard said, a thoughtful expression on his face, the strangest thing happened at one of my properties last week. There was a break-in, but the detective said it was unlike anything he'd seen before. Professional, methodical. They knew exactly what they were after. Grace froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. The room seemed to tilt, the chatter of the other diners fading to a dull roar in her ears. That's terrible, she managed, her voice sounding distant and strained to her own ears. Richard nodded, his brow furrowed. The thing is, I can't shake the feeling that it was an inside job. Someone who knew the layout, the security systems. It's unsettling, thinking that someone close to me might be involved. The irony of his words, spoken to the very person responsible for the crime, was almost too much for Grace to bear. She set down her fork, her appetite vanishing in an instant. I can imagine, she said softly, unable to meet Richard's eyes. As Richard continued to speak about the investigation, about his fears and suspicions, Grace felt as though she were standing on the edge of a precipice. One wrong word, one slip of her carefully constructed mask, and everything would come crashing down. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur. Grace answered Richard's questions mechanically, her mind racing with the implications of what she'd learned. As they stood to leave, Richard placed a gentle hand on the small of her back, the touch both thrilling and terrifying. I had a wonderful time tonight, Grace, he said, his eyes shining with genuine warmth. I hope we can do this again soon. Grace managed a smile, even as her heart ached with the knowledge that she was deceiving this kind, generous man. Thank you, Richard. It was lovely. As they parted ways outside the restaurant, Grace felt the weight of her double life more acutely than ever before. She watched Richard's retreating form, a war raging within her. On one side was the pull of a normal life, the possibility of love and connection with a man who saw her for who she truly was, or at least who he thought she was. On the other was the harsh reality of her situation, the promises she'd made, and the consequences that awaited if she tried to break free. Grace's phone buzzed again, more insistently this time. With trembling hands, she pulled it from her clutch and read the message that would shatter any illusions of normalcy she might have harbored. Job tonight, 2 a.m., the big one we've been planning. Don't be late, or we'll assume you've turned on us. As the words sank in, Grace felt a single tear slip down her cheek, quickly brushed away before anyone could notice. The magical evening with Richard now felt like a dream, rapidly fading in the harsh light of her reality. With a heavy heart, Grace hailed a cab, not to return home and relish in the memories of her date, but to prepare for another night of deception and danger. As the city lights blurred past the window, she couldn't shake the image of Richard's trusting gaze, or the sinking feeling that she was hurtling towards a collision that would destroy everything and everyone she had come to care about. The imposing gates of Richard Blackwood's mansion loomed before Grace, a physical manifestation of the barrier between their worlds. As the taxi pulled away, leaving her alone on the moonlit driveway, Grace felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool night air. "You can do this," she whispered to herself, smoothing down the simple yet elegant dress she'd splurged on for this occasion. "It's just dinner. Just act normal." But as she approached the grand entrance, memories of her last visit to this very property flooded back, memories not of a guest, but of an intruder in the night. Her heart raced as she rang the doorbell, half expecting alarms to blare and guards to emerge from the shadows. Instead, the door swung open to reveal Richard, his face lighting up at the sight of her. "Grace, you look stunning. Please, come in." As Grace stepped into the opulent foyer, she fought to keep her expression neutral. Every painting, every vase, every gleaming surface was painfully familiar. She had cataloged them all during that fateful night, marking which items would fetch the highest prices on the black market. "Would you like a tour?" Richard asked, oblivious to the turmoil beneath Grace's calm exterior. She nodded, not trusting her voice. As Richard led her through room after room, Grace felt as though she were walking through a surreal dream. Here was the study where she had disabled the security system. There was the hallway where she had nearly tripped, her heart stopping at the thought of waking the household. "And this," Richard said, pausing before an ornate door, "is my private gallery. I don't usually show this to guests, but, well, I feel like I can trust you, Grace." The words were like a knife to her heart. As Richard unlocked the door, Grace braced herself for what she knew lay beyond. The room was a treasure trove of priceless artifacts and works of art. Paintings adorned the walls, sculptures stood on pedestals, and display cases held smaller, equally valuable items. Grace's eyes darted from piece to piece, recognizing each one from the detailed plans she and her crew had pored over for weeks. "This is incredible," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard beamed with pride. "It's taken years to build this collection. Each piece has a story, a history." He moved to a display case in the center of the room. "This is one of my favorites." Grace's breath caught in her throat. There, nestled on a velvet cushion, was an ornate golden spoon, the mate to the one that had nearly exposed her at the restaurant. "It's part of a set that's been in my family for generations," Richard explained, his voice warm with nostalgia. "I actually noticed one was missing recently. Must have been misplaced during cleaning." Grace's mind raced. The missing spoon, the one she had seen at the restaurant, must have been accidentally mixed in with the stolen goods from another job. It was a stupid mistake, the kind that could bring everything crashing down. "It's beautiful," she said, forcing a smile. "You must cherish it very much." Richard's gaze softened as he looked at her. "I do. But you know, Grace, I'm starting to realize that there are things far more valuable than any of these objects." The tenderness in his voice, the open affection in his eyes, made Grace's chest tighten with a mixture of longing and guilt. Here was a man offering her everything she had ever dreamed of: security, affection, a chance at a normal life. And yet, with every moment she spent in this house, she was betraying his trust in the most profound way. As they made their way back to the dining room, Grace's phone buzzed insistently in her clutch. She knew without looking that it would be another message from her crew, demanding updates on the layout, on security measures, on Richard's schedule. The weight of her double life pressed down on her, threatening to crush her beneath its burden. Over dinner, Richard regaled her with stories of his travels, his business ventures, his hopes for the future. Grace listened, offering small insights into her own life, carefully edited to reveal nothing of her true circumstances. But with each passing moment, each shared laugh and lingering glance, she felt herself being pulled deeper into Richard's world and further from the life she had known. As the evening drew to a close, Richard walked Grace to the door. "I had a wonderful time tonight," he said softly, his hand gently cupping her cheek. "I hope you'll allow me to see you again soon." Grace looked up into his eyes, seeing the promise of a future she had never dared to imagine for herself. For a moment, she allowed herself to lean into his touch, to imagine what it would be like to belong in this world, to be worthy of the trust and affection Richard was offering. But as his lips met hers in a tender kiss, reality came crashing back. The phone in her clutch buzzed again, an insistent reminder of the lies that stood between them. "Good night, Richard," she whispered, stepping back. "Thank you for a lovely evening." As she walked down the driveway, tears stinging her eyes, Grace knew she had reached a crossroads. The path ahead was fraught with danger, no matter which direction she chose. But one thing was certain: she could no longer continue living this double life. Something had to give. With trembling hands, she pulled out her phone and read the latest message from her crew. "Final planning meeting tomorrow night. The big job goes down in 48 hours. No backing out now." Grace stared at the words, feeling the walls closing in around her. As she hailed a cab, her mind raced with possibilities, each more desperate than the last. Could she find a way to back out of the heist without endangering herself or her mother? Could she confess everything to Richard and throw herself on his mercy? Or was she destined to lose everything: her freedom, her chance at love, and the very person she had become in Richard's eyes? As the cab pulled away from the mansion, Grace cast one last look at the house that held both her greatest hope and her deepest shame. The decision she would make in the coming hours would shape not only her own fate, but that of everyone she had come to care about. The New York City skyline loomed ahead, a glittering promise of opportunity and danger. And somewhere in the shadows of those towering buildings, Grace knew her past was waiting to collide with the future she longed for, in a confrontation that would test the very limits of love, loyalty, and redemption. The harsh fluorescent lights of Grace's tiny apartment flickered erratically, casting a sickly glow over the chaos within. Clothes were strewn across the floor, drawers hung open, and in the center of it all sat Grace, her head in her hands as she struggled to breathe through the panic threatening to overwhelm her. Her phone lay on the coffee table before her, screen cracked but still lit up with a barrage of increasingly threatening messages from her crew. Each vibration felt like another nail in the coffin of the life she'd been desperately trying to build. "Where the hell are you? Answer your damn phone. If you flaked on us, you're dead. You know that, right?" Grace's eyes flicked to the clock on the wall. 2:37 a.m. She should have been at the meeting over an hour ago. Her absence would be seen as nothing short of betrayal. With shaking hands, she picked up her phone and dialed the number she'd sworn never to use. It rang once, twice, before a gruff voice answered. "You better have a damn good explanation, Grace." I can't do this anymore, Marco," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm out. I'm done." The silence on the other end was deafening. When Marco spoke again, his voice was low, dangerous. "You know that's not how this works. You're in this to the end. Or have you forgotten what's at stake?" As if on cue, Grace's gaze fell on the framed photo of her mother on the side table. The smiling face captured there bore little resemblance to the frail woman lying in a hospital bed across town, kept alive by machines that beeped and whirred day and night. "I haven't forgotten," Grace said, closing her eyes against the tears that threatened to fall. "But there has to be another way. I can't keep living like this." Marco's laugh was cold, devoid of humor. "Another way? Sure, if you've got a spare $100,000 lying around to pay off your mother's medical bills. Do you, Grace? Did your new rich boyfriend offer to take care of everything?" The mention of Richard sent a jolt of pain through Grace's chest. The memory of his kind eyes, his gentle touch, only served to highlight the magnitude of her betrayal. "Leave him out of this," she snapped, a spark of defiance flaring to life within her. "Oh, so there is a boyfriend," Marco sneered. "Let me guess. Tall, handsome, loaded. The kind of guy who'd never look twice at a waitress if he knew what she really was." Grace's free hand clenched into a fist, nails digging into her palm. "You don't know anything about him. Or me." "I know enough," Marco shot back. "I know you're soft, weak. I knew bringing you in was a mistake. But your pretty face has its uses. Well, listen up, sweetheart. You're seeing this through. The big job happens tomorrow night, and you'll be there. Or else. The threat hung in the air, unspoken but clear. Grace's mind raced, searching desperately for a way out, a loophole, anything. But she knew, deep down, that she was trapped. "Fine," she whispered, defeated. "I'll be there." "Smart girl," Marco said, his tone dripping with condescension. "And Grace, don't even think about warning your little boyfriend. We've got eyes on you. One wrong move, and Mommy Dearest might just find her life support malfunctioning." The line went dead, leaving Grace in a silence so profound she could hear the blood rushing in her ears. She sat there, motionless, as the first rays of dawn began to creep through her grimy windows. Her phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't Marco or the crew. It was Richard. "Good morning, beautiful. Can't stop thinking about last night. Dinner again soon." The simple message, so full of warmth and promise, was the final straw. Grace broke down, sobs racking her body as the full weight of her situation crashed down upon her. She had less than 24 hours to make an impossible choice. Betray Richard, the man who had shown her a glimpse of a life she'd never dared to dream of, or risk her mother's life and her own freedom. As the morning light filled her apartment, Grace's tears slowly subsided, replaced by a grim determination. She couldn't continue like this, torn between two worlds, suffocating under the weight of her lies. Something had to give. With trembling fingers, she typed out a response to Richard. "Can we meet? There's something I need to tell you. It's important." The reply came almost instantly. "Of course. Is everything okay? My place? 7 p.m. Grace stared at the message, her heart pounding. This was it. The point of no return. Whatever she decided to do next would change the course of her life forever. "I'll be there," she typed, hitting send before she could second-guess herself. As she began to prepare for the day ahead, Grace felt as though she were moving through a dream. The familiar routines of showering, dressing, and heading to her shift at the restaurant felt surreal, disconnected from the turmoil raging within her. With each passing hour, the weight of her impending decision pressed down upon her. As she moved through the restaurant, refilling water glasses and taking orders, her mind raced with possibilities. Could she confess everything to Richard and beg for his help? Would he understand? Or would the betrayal be too much to overcome? And even if he did forgive her, could he protect her from Marco and the crew? Or should she go through with the heist, securing her mother's future but destroying any chance at a life with Richard? The thought of looking into those trusting eyes and knowing she had violated that trust in the most profound way possible made her physically ill. As her shift drew to a close, Grace found herself no closer to a decision. She changed out of her uniform in a daze, her feet carrying her towards Richard's mansion as if on autopilot. The sun was setting as she approached the grand gates, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink that seemed to mock the darkness within her soul. Her finger hovered over the intercom button, her entire body trembling with the magnitude of what she was about to do. In that moment, standing on the precipice of confession or further deception, Grace realized that regardless of what she chose, her life as she knew it was over. The only question that remained was whether she would face the consequences alone, or with Richard by her side. Taking a deep breath, she pressed the button. As the gates swung open, Grace stepped forward into the unknown, her heart racing with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. Whatever happened next would define not just her future, but the very essence of who she was and who she wanted to be. The path ahead was fraught with danger and uncertainty, but one thing was clear: by the end of this night, everything would change. The grandfather clock in Richard's study chimed 7 times, its resonant tones echoing through the cavernous mansion. Grace sat perched on the edge of an antique leather armchair, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap as she watched Richard pour 2 glasses of amber liquid from a crystal decanter. "Here," he said softly, offering her one of the glasses. "You look like you could use this." Grace accepted the drink with a trembling hand, the bourbon burning a path down her throat as she took a hasty sip. Richard settled into the chair across from her, his brow furrowed with concern. "Grace," he began, his voice gentle but firm. "What's going on? You've seemed distant these past few days, and now you say you have something important to tell me. Whatever it is, you can trust me." Trust. The word hung in the air between them, laden with irony. Grace took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she was about to do. "Richard, She started, her voice barely above a whisper. "I haven't been entirely honest with you." She watched as his expression shifted, confusion giving way to wariness. "What do you mean?" Grace's phone buzzed in her pocket, a stark reminder of the ticking clock. In just a few hours, her crew would be expecting her to play her part in the heist. Her mother's life, her own freedom, hung in the balance. "I'm not who you think I am," she continued, her words coming faster now, tumbling out before she could lose her nerve. "The night we met at the restaurant, when I dropped that spoon, it wasn't just clumsiness. I recognized it because I had seen it before, in a house I had robbed." The silence that followed her confession was deafening. Richard's face went through a kaleidoscope of emotions, disbelief, hurt, anger, before settling into an unreadable mask. "Go on," he said, his voice carefully controlled. And so Grace did. She told him everything about her mother's illness, the crushing medical bills, her desperation that led her to fall in with Marco's crew. She explained about the string of high-end robberies, culminating in the plan to hit Richard's own home. "The night you gave me a tour," she said, her voice breaking, "I was cataloging everything, planning the best way to rob you." Richard stood abruptly, turning away from her to face the window. His shoulders were tense, his reflection in the glass a study in conflicted emotions. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked, not turning around. Grace swallowed hard. "Because I can't do it anymore. I can't keep living this lie. And because I've fallen in love with you, Richard. The thought of betraying you, of losing you, it's tearing me apart." Richard turned then, his eyes searching her face. "And your crew? What happens if you don't go through with it?" As if on cue, Grace's phone buzzed again, more insistently this time. She pulled it out, her face paling as she read the message. "Time's up, Grace. You're either with us or against us. Choose wisely." "They're threatening my mother," she whispered, looking up at Richard with tears in her eyes. "If I don't show up tonight, they'll hurt her. Or worse." Richard's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking in his cheek as he processed everything. He moved to the desk, pressing a button on the intercom. "Jenkins, I need you to make some calls. Now." Grace watched, her heart racing, as Richard spoke in low, urgent tones to someone on the other end of the line. When he finished, he turned back to her, his expression a mixture of determination and something else. Something that looked almost like hope. "I've arranged for private security to be sent to your mother's hospital room," he said. "She'll be protected, Grace. You don't have to do this." Relief flooded through Grace, so intense she felt lightheaded. But it was short-lived as the reality of her situation came crashing back. "But what about the crew? They know who I am, where I live. They'll come after me." Richard moved closer, taking her hands in his. "Let me help you, Grace. We can go to the police, explain everything. With your testimony, we can bring these people down." Grace shook her head, panic rising in her throat. "You don't understand. These people, they're dangerous. They have connections. Even if we went to the police, there's no guarantee." "Then we'll leave," Richard said, his voice firm. "Tonight, I have resources, connections of my own. We can disappear, start over somewhere new, somewhere safe." The offer was everything Grace had ever dreamed of, a chance at a new life, free from the shadows of her past. But as she looked into Richard's eyes, she saw something that gave her pause. "Why?" she whispered. "After everything I've done, everything I've told you, why would you help me?" Richard's gaze softened, his thumb gently tracing circles on the back of her hand. "Because I believe in second chances, Grace. And because I think I'm falling in love with you, too." The words hung between them, a lifeline in the storm of uncertainty. Grace felt tears welling up in her eyes, a mixture of relief, gratitude, and a love so intense it threatened to overwhelm her. But before she could respond, her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a text, but a call. Marco's name flashed on the screen, a harsh reminder that her past wasn't done with her yet. Grace looked at Richard, conflict etched across her features. This was the moment of truth, the point of no return. Whatever she decided in the next few seconds would determine the course of not just her life, but Richard's as well. "Answer it," Richard said softly. "Put it on speaker. Whatever happens next, we face it together." With a trembling finger, Grace accepted the call. Marco's voice filled the room, harsh and impatient. "Time's up, sweetheart. Are you in? Or do I need to make some calls of my own?" Grace took a deep breath, her eyes locked with Richard's. In that moment, she made her choice. "I'm out, Marco," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "It's over. I'm done." The silence that followed was charged with tension. When Marco spoke again, his voice was low, dangerous. "You've made your choice, then. I hope you're ready for the consequences." The line went dead, leaving Grace and Richard in a silence that seemed to stretch into eternity. The die was cast, the decision made. There was no going back now. Richard squeezed her hand, his voice gentle but urgent. "We need to move. Now, I have a plane standing by. We can be out of the country before dawn." Grace nodded, her mind racing with the implications of what she'd just done. As they moved through the mansion, hastily packing essentials, she felt as though she were in a dream. Everything was happening so fast, the world spinning around her in a blur of adrenaline and fear and tentative hope. As they reached the front door, Grace paused, looking back at the opulent interior. This house, which had once represented everything she could never have, now stood as a symbol of the life she was leaving behind, both the good and the bad. "Are you sure about this?" she asked Richard, giving him one last chance to back out, to save himself from the storm that was surely coming. Richard's response was to pull her close, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that spoke of promises, of a future yet to be written. When they parted, his eyes were filled with a determination that left no room for doubt. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," he said. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." Hand in hand, they stepped out into the night, leaving behind the shadows of the past and moving towards an uncertain but hopeful future. As the sleek black car pulled away from the mansion, Grace allowed herself to believe, for the first time in years, that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for redemption after all. The New York City skyline receded in the rearview mirror, a glittering reminder of the life they were leaving behind. Ahead lay the unknown, fraught with danger but also possibility. And as the first light of dawn began to break on the horizon, Grace realized that this wasn't just an ending, but a beginning. A chance to rewrite her story, to become the person she'd always wanted to be. And with Richard by her side, she felt, for the first time in her life, truly, completely free. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns of Richard Blackwood's estate. Inside the mansion, an eerie silence reigned, broken only by the soft whirring of state-of-the-art security systems. Grace stood in the shadows of a massive oak tree, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain it would give her away. She glanced at her watch. 2:58 a.m. In 2 minutes, the operation would begin. "Remember the plan," Marco's voice crackled through her earpiece. "You disable the alarms, we move in. Any deviation, and your mother pays the price." Grace swallowed hard, fighting back the wave of nausea that threatened to overwhelm her. This was it, the moment of truth. As she moved towards the house, memories of her dinner with Richard just days ago flashed through her mind. His kind eyes, his gentle touch, the way he looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. And here she was, about to betray him in the worst possible way. With trembling hands, Grace approached the security panel hidden behind a cluster of hydrangeas. She punched in the code she had memorized during her tour of the house, holding her breath as the little light blinked from red to green. "We're in," she whispered into her calm. Within seconds, Dark figures emerged from the shadows, moving with practiced efficiency. Grace watched, her stomach churning, as her crew slipped into the house she had come to associate with warmth and safety. "Good girl," Marco's voice oozed through the earpiece. "Now, get in there and do your job." Grace followed the others into the mansion, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous foyer. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to warn Richard, to do something, anything, to stop this. But the image of her mother, frail and vulnerable in her hospital bed, kept her moving forward. As they made their way to Richard's private gallery, Grace's mind raced. There had to be a way out of this, a way to protect both Richard and her mother. But with each passing second, that possibility seemed to slip further away. The crew worked quickly, disabling additional security measures and carefully removing priceless artifacts from their displays. Grace stood by, her role as lookout feeling more and more like that of a betrayer with each passing moment. Suddenly, a noise from down the hall made everyone freeze. Grace's heart leapt into her throat as she recognized Richard's voice. "Hello? Is someone there?" Marco's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Take care of it," he hissed at Grace, "or I make the call." With leaden feet, Grace moved towards the sound of Richard's voice. She rounded the corner and there he was, looking sleep-rumpled and confused, his eyes widening as he saw her. "Grace, what are you doing here? What's going on?" The concern in his voice was like a knife to her heart. Grace opened her mouth, but no words came out. How could she possibly explain this? Before she could formulate a response, a crash echoed from the gallery. Richard's head snapped towards the sound, realization dawning on his face. "Oh my God," he breathed. "It's happening, isn't it? The robbery you warned me about." Grace's mind reeled. You knew." Richard's eyes softened as he looked at her. "I suspected. After our last dinner, the way you were acting, I hoped you'd come to me, tell me everything. I wanted to help you, Grace." Tears welled up in Grace's eyes. "I'm so sorry, Richard. I didn't know what else to do. They have my mother. They dash." Her words were cut off by a shout from the gallery. "Police! Freeze!" Chaos erupted. The sound of breaking glass and running footsteps filled the air. Grace stood frozen, caught between two worlds, as Richard grabbed her hand. "Come on," he urged. "We need to get out of here." But before they could move, Marco appeared, his face contorted with rage. "You bitch," he snarled at Grace. "You set us up." He raised his gun, aiming it squarely at Grace's chest. Time seemed to slow down. Grace saw Richard's eyes widen in horror, heard the shouts of the police growing closer. In that moment, she made her choice. Grace threw herself in front of Richard just as Marco pulled the trigger. Pain exploded in her shoulder, and she stumbled back into Richard's arms. Through the haze of agony, she heard more shouting, the sound of a scuffle, and then silence. When she opened her eyes, she was lying on the floor, Richard cradling her head in his lap. His face was pale, his eyes filled with tears. "Stay with me, Grace," he pleaded. "Help is coming. Just hold on." Grace tried to speak, to explain, to apologize for everything. But the words wouldn't come. As the edges of her vision began to darken, she heard Richard's voice, strong and clear. "I know everything, Grace, and I forgive you. We're going to get through this together. I promise." As sirens wailed in the distance and the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, Grace felt a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope for redemption, for a future, for love. With Richard's hand holding hers tightly, Grace closed her eyes, finally at peace. Whatever came next, she knew she wouldn't face it alone. The grand heist, planned for months, had come to an unexpected end. But for Grace and Richard, it was just the beginning of a new chapter, one built on truth, forgiveness, and the unshakable bond forged in the crucible of that fateful night. The steady beep of hospital monitors filled the sterile room as Grace slowly opened her eyes. Blinding white light assaulted her senses, causing her to squint as she tried to orient herself. As her vision cleared, she found Richard sitting beside her bed, his hand gently clasping hers, dark circles under his eyes betraying sleepless nights. "Hey there," he said softly, a relieved smile spreading across his face. "Welcome back." Grace tried to speak, but her throat felt like sandpaper. Richard quickly offered her a cup of water, helping her take small sips. As the cool liquid soothed her parched throat, the memories of that fateful night came flooding back. "Richard," she croaked, her eyes filling with tears. "I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen." Richard squeezed her hand, his gaze intense. "Grace, listen to me. What's done is done. You made mistakes, yes, but you also saved my life. That counts for something." Before Grace could respond, the door opened, and two stern-faced detectives entered the room. Richard straightened, his posture protective. "Ms. Thompson," the older detective began, his voice gruff but not unkind. "We need to ask you some questions about the events at Mr. Blackwood's estate." Grace's heart raced. This was it, the moment of truth. She looked at Richard, who nodded encouragingly. Taking a deep breath, Grace began to speak. She told them everything about her mother's illness, the crushing medical bills, how she'd been drawn into Marco's world of high-stakes theft. She explained her role in the robberies, her growing feelings for Richard, and the impossible choice she'd faced that night. As she spoke, Grace felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. For so long, she'd lived in fear, trapped by her secrets. Now finally, the truth was out. When she finished, silence filled the room. The detectives exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. "Ms. Thompson," the younger detective finally said, "you understand that you're admitting to multiple felonies?" Grace nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know, and I'm prepared to face the consequences of my actions." Richard leaned forward, his voice firm. "Detectives, I'd like to point out that Ms. Thompson's testimony will be crucial in bringing down a major criminal enterprise. Her cooperation should count for something." The older detective sighed, rubbing his temples. "It's not that simple, Mr. Blackwood. The DA will have to dash." He was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway. The door burst open, and a familiar figure rushed in. Grace's mother, looking frail but determined, pushed in a wheelchair by a nurse. "Mom!" Grace gasped, tears streaming down her face. "How are you here?" Her mother reached for her hand, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and sorrow. "Richard arranged for me to be transferred here." "Oh, my sweet girl. What have you gotten yourself into?" As Grace's mother joined the group, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The detectives listened as she spoke of her illness, of Grace's desperate attempts to provide for her care, of the guilt she felt for putting such a burden on her daughter. Hours passed as statements were taken, phone calls were made, and heated discussions took place in hushed tones. Throughout it all, Richard never left Grace's side, his unwavering support a beacon of hope in the storm of uncertainty. Finally, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the hospital room, the older detective cleared his throat. "Given the unique circumstances of this case, and Ms. Thompson's willingness to cooperate fully in the investigation of Marco's organization, the DA is prepared to offer a deal." Grace held her breath, scarcely daring to hope. "In exchange for your testimony and full cooperation, you'll be charged with lesser offenses. You're looking at probation and community service, Ms. Thompson. No jail time." A sob of relief escaped Grace's lips. Her mother squeezed her hand, tears glistening in her eyes. "However," the detective continued, his tone serious, "this is your one chance. Any violation of the terms of your probation, any hint of returning to your old life, and you'll face the full consequences of your actions. Do you understand?" Grace nodded solemnly. "I understand. Thank you. I promise I won't let you down." As the detectives left, Grace turned to Richard, her eyes searching his face. "After everything I've done, everything you now know about me, where do we go from here?" Richard took both of her hands in his gaze steady and full of warmth. "Grace, when I said I was falling in love with you, I meant it. The past few days haven't changed that. If anything, seeing your bravery, your willingness to sacrifice yourself for others, it's only made me love you more." He paused, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "But I think we both have some healing to do. Why don't we start over?" "Hi, I'm Richard Blackwood. It's nice to meet you." Grace laughed through her tears, feeling a spark of hope ignite in her chest. "Hi, Richard. I'm Grace Thompson. It's nice to meet you too." As they shared a tender kiss, Grace's mother watching with a mixture of joy and relief, Grace felt as though she were standing on the threshold of a new life. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be legal battles, therapy sessions, and the long process of rebuilding trust. But for the first time in years, she felt truly free. The weight of her secrets had been lifted, replaced by the promise of a future built on honesty, redemption, and love. As she looked at Richard, at her mother, at the new path stretching out before her, Grace realized that sometimes it takes facing our darkest moments to find our way into the light. And as the last rays of sunlight faded from the hospital room, Grace Thompson closed her eyes, no longer a thief in the shadows, but a woman ready to step into the brightness of a new day, scarred, but stronger, and finally truly herself. So, if you haven't subscribed yet, click the subscribe button below and join our community. Based on your interests, we've picked this story for you that's showing on your screen right now. Click to watch it now. We're sure you'll love it. See you next time.